Hi, today's lecture is going to deal with the famous French philosopher René Descartes. You have a handout, and I've already highlighted certain passages for you to focus on. These are two separate excerpts. One is from his 1637 book, Discourse on Method, and the second one is 1641, his book, Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes was French, and he wrote in Latin and French, and he died in Sweden. He was a huge celebrity during the age of reason, the late scientific revolution, and a big hero of the French Enlightenment. We'll discover today what he meant by "I think, therefore I am," and we'll also look at the quandary he left us in, namely with a dualism that divided reality into two things. We'll talk more about the philosophy of mind later, but in a separate lecture. Today, I just want to focus on Descartes himself. So, 1637, by the way, it's interesting to just put it in historical perspective. That's 7 years after the Puritans were settling in Boston. So this is very early on. This is 50 years or so before the Salem witch trials. It's at the height of the scientific revolution. Galileo was a few years before. Descartes and Newton is still to come in the future. But Descartes was very, very important. He's living during a time when certain knowledge is being questioned. What could we be certain about? The scientific revolution had thrown a whole bunch of questions up into the air. Up until Descartes' time, people would take the Bible literally. They would look to scholastic philosophy. That's the philosophy of the schools. What that means is the philosophy of the Middle Ages in the church universities. Best example of that would be Thomas Aquinas, and we'll look at him later in the semester. People assumed that Aristotle was right about everything. People assumed that the sun went around the earth. They assumed that Galen was correct in terms of the blood within the body. Now all of a sudden we discovered that the earth goes around the sun, that things that are quite literal in the Bible or things that were said in Aristotle are not true. What can we be certain about? This is Descartes' key question. He's not trying to do philosophy of mind, and he's not trying to prove that he exists. A lot of students will say on an examination, for example, Descartes was trying to prove that he exists. He knows he exists. He's one of the smartest people in Europe at this time. That wasn't his question. That's not the meaning of "I think, therefore I am." He was trying to find out what he could be certain about, because he came up through the ranks studying the traditional, philosophy as it had been done for the last 300 or 400 years, with lots of Aristotle. He himself was making a huge contribution to mathematics. You may know about Cartesian coordinates. Cartesian is the adjective form of Descartes' last name. So he did a lot of work also in some other fields as well. So he's known as a mathematician as well as a philosopher, and he did a lot of science as well. So I just want to pick up with this search for certainty. So if you have this handout, Discourse on Method, please follow along with me, and I'm looking at the highlighted passages. This Discourse on Method it has different sections in it. I've only given you an excerpt from the fourth part. At the beginning here, he's talking about, the meditations or contemplations he's been thinking about here. And he states here, right in the middle of that paragraph, "I desire to devote myself exclusively to the search for truth." Very typical of a philosopher or a scientist, very typical of the 17th century attitude as well. And then he goes on to say, "I thought it necessary that I do exactly the opposite, and that I reject as absolutely false everything in which I could imagine the least doubt. in order to see whether, after this process, something in my beliefs remained that was entirely indubitable. In other words, without doubt, beyond doubt. This is a hypothetical doubt. He's not really doubting all these things, but it's hypothetical. If I can doubt everything, can I find something that is beyond doubt? This is what he's trying to do. And what he says here, he says, hypothetically, he says, I, Rene Descartes, great mathematician, but, it's possible I made some mistakes in my mathematics. Maybe my math is, mistaken in some ways. Maybe sometimes I make an error with my senses, empirically. We've all had an experience of waving to somebody in a supermarket, thinking it's your next door neighbor, then realizing it's not. It happens, at least once or twice a year, somebody comes up and starts talking to me. I don't know who they are. You've probably had the same mistake. As Descartes says, we oftentimes mistake brass for gold, or glass for diamonds. Our senses can give us false information. And then he says, hypothetically, maybe everything around me is a dream. He doesn't use the word hallucination. That's a later term. But he says, what if it's a dream? What if it's like a lucid dream? And here I want to make reference to The Matrix. Some of you may know the great science fiction film The Matrix, with the cool martial arts in there and everything. The Wachowski brothers, when they were doing The Matrix, were very steeped in philosophy. There's lots of Plato in there. There's lots of Descartes in there. And that's a very good situation. Neo, for example, in The Matrix, exists, but everything around him is a digital projection. It's fake, it's phony. This is kind of what Descartes is suggesting. So having doubted everything around him, the knowledge that comes from the senses, the knowledge that comes from his mathematical and logical reasonings, even his day-to-day existence, maybe it's a dream. Is there anything he can't doubt? So follow me down to the bottom of the page here. He says, immediately afterward, I noticed that while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. And noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it, I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. So, having thought through everything, said, what if I doubt everything around me? Well, I'm sitting here thinking and I'm doubting. If there's doubting going on, if there's thinking going on, there must be a doubter. There must be a thinker. I am this thinker. Therefore, at least I can be assured of one thing that exists. That's me, as a thinking self, a thinking entity. The I think, which in Latin is cogito. Cogito is actually the verb for that, but I think, but we sometimes refer to the cogito as the thinking self when we talk about Descartes. So he's sure about the cogito. That is the meaning of cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Je pense donc je suis in French. So this is the case. And I want to back up and take a look at this word necessarily. Later in this semester, we'll look at the word necessity as it applies to philosophy. Necessity means that it has to be the case, because to assert the opposite would be a logical contradiction. I may make a mistake counting, one pencil, two pencils, maybe I've got three pencils, but the concept of 1 + 1 = 2, that's necessarily the case. It's based upon the definition of what one is. A triangle is a three-sided geometrical figure. If you ever find a four-sided triangle, well, you found yourself a parallelogram or a square, but what you don't have is a triangle. By definition, a triangle is a three-sided figure. So it's necessarily the case. If there's thinking going on, there must be a thinker. This thinker, by definition, would exist. So he's very convinced he's onto something here, and he's going to make this the foundation stone of his philosophy. That's what he means by first principle. This is going to be the starting point of his theory of knowledge and his theory of reality. And after doubting everything, which is just a method that he's using, he can now reassemble his house of knowledge from proofs that derive from this concept of I think, therefore I am. I want to continue on here. Next paragraph, he says, then examining with attention what I was and seeing that I could pretend that I had no body and that there was no world nor any place where I was, I could not pretend on that account that I did not exist at all, and that on the contrary, from the very fact that I thought of doubting the truth of other things, it followed very evidently and very certainly that I existed. Okay? It's possible that, he could be, for example, dreaming his body. Maybe I'm not really sitting here in front of my desk recording myself. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat, like in the Matrix, and this whole thing is being projected. So it may not be the case that I have 2 arms and 2 legs. I'm just dreaming that I have 2 arms and 2 legs. That means that my body is not necessarily what I think it is. It's contingent. My relationship to my body then might not be what I think it is, but my relationship to my thinking self must be what I think it is. By introducing this idea, he opens the door on dualism here, because if in fact the physical body, the physical world is not the way I think it is, but the mental world is, well, that allows him to slide into this dualism. We'll get to that in a moment. Continuing on the second page of this first handout, he says, from this I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is simply to think. We use the word here in Latin, res cogitans, thinking substance, as opposed to a res extensa, a thing which has extension. My body has extension. My mind or my consciousness does not. And again, Descartes means consciousness here. He uses the word mind. He sometimes uses the word soul, but for him, soul and mind are the equivalent. For Descartes, it made no sense to assert that a physical thing like a body, which is just a lump of meat, a lump of flesh, could do anything. How could it make a decision to go across the room? How could it make a decision to think? It was physical matter. The body had to have in it a soul or a mind that animates it. And that was his solution to how it can come to pass that I can pick up a bottle of water and move it, and how my mind can actually cause my body to go across the room. Of course, he's opened up another problem here. How do you explain the connection of something that's mental or a soul substance, the res cogitans, with something that's physical? He doesn't really tackle that. I'm continuing on. He says in the next sentence, thus this I, that is to say the soul through which I know, the soul through which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body. So again, the mind is distinct from the body because the mind must exist, because I'm doubting something, I'm thinking about doubt. I know that I exist. And my body might not be what I think it is. It could be like the Matrix. It could be something totally different. And even if there were no body at all, it would not cease to be all that it is. So here you've got the positing of the initial dualism in Descartes. I call this the problem of the 2 ontologies, 2 kinds of existing stuff, the res cogitans and the res extensa. I'm going to look quickly at the next passage, not quite so long. This is from his Meditations in 1641. He develops a very similar argument, so I won't be spending as much time on this one. In the second paragraph here, he says, therefore, I suppose that everything I see is false. Same argument he made in the earlier book. I believe that none of what my deceitful memory represents ever existed. I have no senses whatever. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. What then will be true? So on the next page, I'm going to go over to the following page here. It says page 64 at the top. I'm going to go to the first and second paragraphs. He says here, but doubtless I did exist if I persuaded myself of something. But there is some deceiver or other who is supremely powerful and supremely sly, and who is always deliberately deceiving me. This is called the evil genius, depending upon the translation into English. Descartes, even hypothetically, being a good Christian, a good Catholic, and he needed to have his books approved by the church to be published, didn't want to say God would be playing games with me, so he comes up with this idea of some kind of evil deceiver who's not God, think here again of the Matrix, okay? So with these are kind of computer-generated realities. There is some deceiver that makes him think he's Rene Descartes living in the 17th century in France, but it's not the case. He says, continuing, then too there is no doubt that I exist. If he is deceiving me, and let him do his best at deception, he will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall think that I am something. And he says, thus, after everything has been carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, different wording, same meaning as cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. So there's an alternate description of his argument. A final thought on Descartes here. Next paragraph, he asks, but I do not yet understand sufficiently what I am. He spends the next couple pages talking about what things he might be. I'm going to take you right to the conclusion. On page 66, the second paragraph, he concludes, he says, but what then am I? A thing that thinks, a res cogitans, a thinking thing. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and it also imagines and senses. This idea of what makes humans special, that it's our intellectual capacity, goes back to Aristotle and to Plato, but going forward from Descartes' time, it's also become one of the dominant ideas of what it means to be human. We are a mind that does its own thinking independent of the body, independent of biology, independent of the neurons in our brain. We're just thinking things. We're thinking machines, and we can add on to that, we're thinking machines that have a soul. So it's very compatible with Christianity as well. And that's where Descartes leaves us. We'll see in the next lecture, I want to pick up with the dualism problem. For Descartes' part, he's convinced he's solved the problem of certainty. He's raised here a new method, doubt everything to see what you can be certain of. He has, to his satisfaction, explained what it means to be human. But at the same time, he's created a world of two kinds of stuff. We'll see John Searle in our next lecture talking about this. And talking here about this unresolved problem since the time of Descartes. How can a world of mindless physical particles, molecules and atoms, become arranged in such a way that it gives rise to consciousness, to free will, to intentionality, to self-awareness? And that is a profound problem. And we'll see that by the time we get to the 20th century, this has become a major focal point of philosophy. Thank you.